Welcome, everyone. We're glad that you're joining us today, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of your questions and also hearing the presentation. Many of you know that at C2ES, we've been highlighting and conducting discussions over the last 2 years about how to achieve deep decarbonization and deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide through the United States. And we've been doing this through our initiative called Climate Innovation 2050. Critical pieces of information that have been discussed and that need to be discussed are looking at scenarios for the future. If we want to look at what we need to do out to the middle of the century, we have to look at, well, what might be happening. And so we have to look at different types of companies, different parts of the economy. It's not just the power sector when we're talking about energy. We're talking about energy use and energy throughout the system. So we're looking at the power companies, we're looking at transportation, manufacturing, mining, oil and gas, cement, high technology, finance. How does this get financed? Agricultural sectors. It's important that we look at all of those sectors. And then what are the different policy options that might work, and how does the economy react to those different policy options? And we produced a report last year that was a result of some of this type of analysis called Getting to Zero, a Climate Agenda for the United States. And since we've done that, we've continued to work with companies and with other stakeholders, and companies themselves have been doing analysis and predicting how consumers and policymakers and investors will respond to climate change itself, as well as policies, is a feat, to say the least. But exercising a careful approach and looking at scenarios, you can really start to visualize path or plural paths forward, depending on different activities. And so the Shell company has, as many companies have, conducted research and an extensive process looking at scenarios into the future. They have a whole process that's sort of under an umbrella called Sky Scenario Analysis to lay out paths to achieving decarbonization and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And they have looked at the entire US energy system, not just oil and gas and not just the power sector, but the entire US energy system. And we're going to hear today what their look has seen. And so today, joining us are going to be Jeremy Bentham, who is Vice President and Global Business Environment and Head of Shell Scenarios, Dr. Mallika Ishwaran, who is a Senior Economist for Shell, and David Hone, who is the Chief Climate Advisor for the company. So I'm welcoming you all here with us today to hear your presentation. And so, Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Bob. And I'm going to assume I'm off mute, that people can hear me until I hear otherwise. And really, it is a privilege. Thank you for the invitation for us to be able to share some of our recent work with such a kind of fantastically large group of people who are obviously fellow enthusiasts in thinking about the future of energy. And this work we'll share kind of builds on lessons from our recent experience of over 50 years of scenario practice in the company. It's been part of our way of thinking strategically for that time, along, of course, with the deep global energy market analysis that a company like ours can do. When considering the future, we know there are many uncertainties, and people deal with uncertainties in different ways. So we can move to the next slide. This is one way that folks deal with uncertainty. And people kind of like to say that our company is a company of Dutch engineers, Scottish accountants, and American lawyers. And so this is one American lawyer way of dealing with uncertainty. So I'm going to assume that you've all absorbed this very, very rapidly and mentally clicked the I accept button. And I'll move on to the way we as business executives really think about uncertainty. And we do that through the scenario mindset. And you mentioned, Bob, scenarios. And really, what this is about is recognizing, as the behavioral economists say, that people are kind of trapped within what they see being all there is, their own experience. And we need to stretch the horizons of our decision makers in order to make richer decisions. Nobody wants to walk blindly into the future. So this is all about making better choices now, because you understand something about the way those choices have implications for the future. And I've seen this practice has helped us, for example, neither overreact nor underreact to various disruptions, whether that was the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, or right now with the work we've recently published on rethinking the 2020s from the current disruptions. So we want to survive as an organization, and to paraphrase Darwin, it's not the strongest in the species that survives or the most intelligent, it's the most adaptable to change. And in the human context, that comes down to capacity to learn. So our scenarios are really a learning tool. And we can move to the next slide. And that journey, kind of begins with exploring contexts into insight generation and then decision-centered. And this, what we call a sketch for the United States, really captures the insights that we've developed into what's needed to achieve net zero emissions in the energy system in the next 30 years. So it builds on that sky scenario that we published in 2018, but it tightens the time dimension even further to meet what's emerging as the aspirations to achieve net zero emissions on that time scale. So Mallika will take you through the details shortly, but my biggest simple lesson from this work is what an opportunity for the US. I've been largely educated, certainly in graduate terms, in the US, but I'm European by origin. But I've seen how, as we've tightened these timescales, the particular advantages of the US really come to the fore. So there's a real opportunity to boost domestic and international competitiveness by leveraging the abundant natural resources of land for biofuels, solar resource, wind resource, natural gas, geological structures for storing carbon dioxide. And combined with that kind of culture of innovation and entrepreneurship can lead to this new kind of clean energy independence in the United States. And also that leading position in technologies that will definitely be in demand worldwide. So that was my big lesson, but there are many more lessons in the details. And so with that, I'm going to hand over, if I may, to Mallika to take you through those insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Pleasure to be here and to share this analysis. So what I'm going to do is take sort of the next 25 minutes to go through our analysis in three sort of broad sections. First is looking at what needs to change, and this is looking at what are the energy system changes that we would want, that would need to occur over the next 30 years for the US to reach this target of net zero CO2 emissions from its energy system by 2050. Then I'll pause a little bit to look at what is it that the US net zero energy system looks like in 2050, both in terms of the energy mix as well as the emissions from it. And then finally sort of conclude on how to make progress along this pathway. Because one thing that has come out quite strongly is that this is not something that's going to happen organically over the course of the next 30 years. It needs intent and coordinated action to get it going. So if we go to the next slide, please. Yes, and the next one. Thank you. So yes, looking at the energy system itself, the change to go from the system of today to something that is net zero CO2 emissions from energy in 2050 really requires a fundamental change in how both energy is produced, so how the supply side is decarbonized, but also in terms of how energy is consumed in some of the end use sectors like industry, transport, and buildings. Now, looking at the energy system changes, broadly, we looked at what changes around accelerating clean technologies, looking at changes around improving energy efficiency and the use and adoption of low carbon fuels. And then finally, looking at the role of removing carbon emissions, whether through natural or man-made sinks. If you go to the next slide, what I'll do is go through each of these elements of our energy system change in fairly short order, but hopefully you get the sense of the system-wide change that needs to happen. The first sort of element of this change, which is not unique to this analysis, is the role of electrification in the US pathway towards this outcome. So again, significant increase in electrification. Today, electricity accounts for about 20% of the energy system. In this pathway, we have electrification going to above 60% by 2050. So substantial increase in electrification over this period. Then the electricity system in 2050 is more than twice the size of what exists today. And if you compare this to sort of the rate of electrification that we've seen historically over the last century, and that's what the chart on this slide shows, you see that on average per decade, it's about a 2.5 percentage points increase in electrification each decade since the 1960s. And here we have that needing to ramp up to 5 times that rate of electrification in order to get to the over 60% share of electricity. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, with this much larger electricity system is the need to meet that demand through low carbon electrons. So again, here we're seeing not just a fundamental change in the mix of energy that's used, goes into producing that electricity, but also a significant ramp up of that mix of new energy sources that's required now to then meet the need of this much larger electricity system. Now, at the bottom of this chart on the left, the green sort of bar, if you like, is natural gas. So you see the levels of natural gas coming down over the course of the next 30 years, particularly post-20 in the latter half of the 2030s. And then this is mainly when it exists in 2050 is with carbon capture and storage. So again, the energy system emissions from this energy source are reduced through that mechanism. The black bar that you see is coal. So the coal leaves the electricity system in this analysis by 2035. There is a role for nuclear, which continues, and that's the sort of light yellow bar above the coal. That continues at the level that it is today. It has a much smaller share of the electricity system because the system itself is so much bigger. But the level of nuclear continues to account for the same amount of sort of roughly electricity generated as today. Now, the big story though here are the bars above that, which are the renewables that come into the system. So by 2050, 85% of electricity generation is through renewable sources. So this includes wind and solar. In fact, solar becomes the largest source of electricity generation in the mid-2030s, followed by wind after that. The other sort of element, the third sort of renewable resource that comes into play is biomass. So there's a significant role for biomass in generating electricity, and particularly towards 2050 with carbon capture and storage, so that it becomes a source, the electricity system becomes a source of negative emissions for the entire energy system. If you go to the next slide, please. So we talked a lot about the electrons that were needed and the massive increase in electrification of the US economy. But if 60% electrification means there's 40% or so that is where the energy needs cannot be met through electrification. So So these are sectors, what we call the hard to abate sectors, where rather than electricity, you need low carbon molecules coming into play. And one of these low carbon molecules to meet the energy needs of these types of sectors like aviation or shipping or industry is hydrogen. So again, here we have a significant ramp up and in the development and deployment of hydrogen. In the initial years, in this decade, it's built up around gray hydrogen, transitioning to blue hydrogen, which is made from natural gas with carbon capture and storage, and eventually most of this demand being met by green hydrogen or hydrogen produced from renewable sources of electricity. So again, you see the really sharp ramp up that we have in the deployment of hydrogen. The main sectors that it comes into play are around road transport, passenger transport, and freight transport, particularly in the heavy duty vehicle segment. The other sort of important sector where hydrogen ends up playing quite a strong role is in industry, as well as in the residential sector in urban areas to replace gas as a source of heating. So again, hydrogen ramps up from negligible levels today to about 7% of the energy system in 2050. In the transport sector, particularly in the freight transport sector, in this analysis, about 25% of the truck fleet, or 1.5 million trucks, are hydrogen trucks by 2050. If you go to the next slide, please. The other sort of source of low carbon molecules are biofuels. So again, here we see a 30% increase in the levels of biofuel demand in between today and 2040, so over the next 20 years. And again, that's to meet the increasing demand in sectors such as aviation and chemicals for this sort of low carbon molecule to help that sector decarbonize. Now, what you notice is post-2040, there's a decline in the volumes required of biofuels. And this reflects the fact that the road transport sector, which is the primary consumer of biofuels today, declines and becomes more electrified. And as a result of the greater electrification, the demand for biofuels for that sector declines, leading to an overall decline in the level from 2040. But in 2050, there are a couple of interesting things to note. Firstly, the biofuels that are in the system are sort of now more based on advanced biofuels rather than first generation. So there's a shift away in terms of the feedstock that's used to produce it. And also it's prioritized for the hardest to abate sectors, like, as I said, aviation and chemicals. The next slide. Thank you. So another sort of low carbon molecule, and this is biomass. And again, a significant role for biomass in the US energy system going forward. Based on this sketch, we see a 5-fold increase in the level of biomass being deployed in the economy. The main sectors that it appears in are firstly power, as I mentioned, particularly with carbon capture and storage, so that the power sector becomes a source of negative emissions for the system as a whole. The other sort of important sector where biomass plays is industry. So in some industrial sectors which require thermal heat and energy dense fuels, biomass is the low carbon solution. And again, in these sectors, in these industries, with carbon capture and storage, it provides a mechanism for providing negative emissions in this context. We go to the next slide. So now our next sort of bucket or lever that we looked at in terms of energy system change is around sort of more behavioral and sort of choices that can be made. Energy efficiency in this sketch, in this scenario, is assumed to increase substantially over the next 30 years. Now, if you look at the US from 1990 to 2019, energy demand energy consumption, grew by about 20%. And over this period, you saw the economy almost doubled. So you're seeing some relative decoupling between the growth and energy consumption. What we assume is going forward that this trend continues for the next 30 years. So we assume that the energy intensity of GDP, which declined by around 40% between 1990 and 2019, continues. So we have another 45% decline in the energy intensity of GDP over the next 30 years going forward. Now, one thing that is worth sort of highlighting is the nature and the sort of the effort to realize this level of energy efficiency. The assumption here is that lower hanging fruit have already been sort of picked over the last 30 years. So going forward, the energy efficiency gains are the more tricky and more expensive options, including building and sort of more efficient urban infrastructure, for example, to optimize energy use in urban areas. And another big element of the improvement is around electrification, as electricity is a more efficient carrier and helps drive this trend. If you go to the next slide. And we look again carbon pricing and the role of carbon pricing within this sketch, which was again quite important, but again quite nuanced in terms of the role it plays and the level it achieves over the next 30 years. So in this scenario sketch, the carbon price rises, but it rises slowly in the initial years and then ramps up towards the end of this scenario period towards 2050. So it's really a backloaded sort of carbon pricing lever that we use here. And the purpose is because in the initial years, the carbon price drives energy efficiency improvements, not just in homes, but also in industrial sort of industry and industrial energy efficiency. It also helps drive a reallocation of resources and capital towards low carbon, so to level the playing field between low carbon and fossil investments. And it works very much alongside technology policy, which is focused in on driving down costs of low carbon technologies and fuels, as well as driving their adoption and take up. It also sits alongside infrastructure policies that are then sort of incentivizing and investing in the infrastructure that's needed, that once these in parallel to these low carbon fuels and technologies commercializing. Now, towards the latter end of this sort of forecast scenario period, the carbon price does go up to about $140 per ton of CO2. At this point, the role is around shifting and making businesses and consumers shift towards low carbon choices as those technologies and fuels become available and as the infrastructure is put in place to allow them to then take that up. And eventually in 2050, the carbon price is required to bridge the cost differential between fossil and low carbon fuels and technologies in sectors like aviation, where the cost differential is expected to persist. So again, quite a nuanced and a varied role for carbon price over the course of this scenario period. Go to the next slide. This brings us to the third of our levers that we looked at, which is around removing carbon emissions. So the way we approached this analysis was to look and see what we could do in terms of accelerating clean technologies. What are the changes that you could see through energy efficiency and through carbon pricing in terms of behavioral shifts? And then we looked at the emissions that remained and the energy that remained and sort of considered carbon capture and storage for those hard to abate and residual emissions. So in this sketch, CCS has a really important role. It ramps up over time, and by 2050, 1 gigaton of CO2 approximately is captured annually and stored in permanent storage eventually. Now, a lot of this, about 0.3 of this gigaton, so a third of this CCS, is in the power sector. And it is, as a result of putting carbon capture and storage on biomass generated power. So again, a lot of the CCS is coming through that, through the power sector. Also, any remaining gas in the electricity sector is fitted with CCS, and so that's reflected in the big share of the power sector full amount of CCS that's deployed. I mean, again, as I mentioned previously, industry is a huge, also another sector where CCS is deployed to address the emissions that are the hardest to abate. And again, put them together and you have, sort of the 1 gigaton of CCS that's required in this sketch. If we move to the next slide. So this is now, if we did all these changes and if we had all these, technological changes, behavioral changes, as well as investment in removals, what would this energy system in the US look like in 2050? If we go to the next slide. So this chart on the left sort of shows you the change in total final consumption of energy between today and 2050. So the first thing to note is that total energy demand, total energy consumption comes down, but from today's by about 15 to 20%. So it's lower as a result of all the sort of measures to improve efficiency of energy consumption. And this is around electrification and smarter urban infrastructure. So overall, energy total consumption declines. The other sort of big story, of course, is the mix that changes within this. So the two light blue and dark blue bars at the bottom show the share of electricity. So again, you see the ramp up in the rate of electrification and the share that electricity has over 60% of energy consumption in 2050. Now, the red bar above that is sort of liquid fuels, and a lot of this is oil currently. But over time, we see this shifting, firstly declining, and then shifting towards greater use of biofuels to displace fossil fuels. There is a role for gas that remains in the system, as you can see from the green bar. It's a declining role. And a lot of the uses that gas is put to today are taken over and replaced by hydrogen. And so that's sort of the slightly pink bar above the green. But some gas does remain in the system, and that is, needs to be, is offset by some of the negative emissions that are produced. And then finally, there is biomass, so the sort of the light brown on the top of this chart. And that's the biomass that's going into industry and other uses in order to help them decarbonize. So that's really a snapshot of the energy system as it evolves over the next 30 years in this analysis. If we can move to the next slide. So this is the sort of how the emissions trajectory and profile looks over time. So you can see overall emissions decline quite steeply between now and 2050. Now we always represent this chart by sector, because again, the story varies quite a bit sector by sector, with some sectors are easier to electrify and hence to decarbonize. But there are other sectors, as I said, of like aviation or shipping or chemicals or steel, where electrification doesn't really meet the needs of that particular sector. And so we have to think of other solutions to help them decarbonize, and to decarbonize over the same time frame of 30 years. So again, you can see by 2050, the sectors that continue to emit and persist are aviation primarily, and some remaining sort of emissions from the road transport segment. So they are the hardest to abate. And despite in this time frame we have, they still continue to be emissions that remain. But the negative emissions that are produced from the power sector using biomass with carbon capture and storage, as well as the industrial sector using biomass with carbon capture and storage, offset those emissions that are still remaining in these hard to abate sectors. So overall, the US system reaches net zero by 2050. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is a sort of a, we looked at the role of natural carbon sinks, but it's also worth highlighting that in this analysis, we don't need natural carbon sinks in order for the US energy systems to get to net zero. But the US does have significant technical potential around nature-based solutions, if you like. We estimate around 300 million tons of CO2 per year could be captured through afforestation. And again, the role for nature-based solutions could be quite significant in the transition to net zero. For example, sectors like aviation, even though they transition to net zero by 2050, they continue to grow quite strongly across the world in the next decade or two. So emissions from aviation, for example, continue to rise quite steeply over the next 10, 15 years. So again, there's a role for natural carbon sinks to help sort of offset those increase in emissions in the transition. as a way of keeping the world within its carbon budget and ensuring that the level of overshoot is minimized. So again, very important, you could see an important role for this lever in the transition, if not necessarily in the net zero energy system in the US. Again, potential for the US to become a lead player in the international carbon offset market. But again, the scale, realizing this technical potential is not trivial. And we did a little calculation of a proof point around this, and really realizing it requires planting around 64 million acres, which is this area the size of Colorado. So it's quite a big challenge, but the potential exists for if needed. If you go to the next slide. So now I'll just focus on how to make progress. And again, this was something which was, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, wasn't something that was obvious and organic. It really required intent and coordinated intent to make progress in the sort of fairly short time frame we have to fundamentally change the energy system. If you go to the next slide. So it's sort of three areas that we looked at in terms of making that need to be looked at to make progress. First was around mitigating economic and social impacts. So again, here we looked at what are the macro costs to the economy and to the society of making this transition to net zero. And again, here the overall net costs are relatively modest, like we've seen with other countries and also in terms of global analysis. So it's a few percentage point of GDP in 2050. So really, it's a really manageable for the scale of change that's needed. But it has to be managed to ensure that those costs remain at those minimum levels. The other sort of thing to recognize is while the macro level, the costs or the change is not large, underneath that, there is significant sort of realignment of resources and activity. For example, shifting of activity from currently fossil-rich regions and states in the US towards, sort of those that are rich in wind, solar, and biomass, for example. So again, managing, ensuring and making progress is about managing that transition at a regional level so that every single state or region feels part of the transition and has something to offer in making that transition happen. The other element is around sort of the distributional impacts. And by this, I mean the impact of the transition on communities and sort of and on society, and ensuring that those who are the most vulnerable don't face or are disproportionately facing the costs of this transition, whether that's in the terms of higher energy prices in the transition, or being displaced in terms of jobs and employment as a result of the transition. In fact, this energy transition could be used as a basis, if you're being ambitious, to actually provide and improve not just environmental outcomes, but also economic outcomes by looking at where jobs and demand might move to communities maybe that are more underprivileged, underserved today. So there are sort of, looking at how do you have to sort of think through how to manage the overall macro costs down, as well as to manage the regional and distributional aspects of change in order to make sure that the change happens in a pretty quick time frame that we have here. The second sort of aspect of this is around sectoral coalitions for action. And again, here we focus on how to abate sectors where, again, electrification is not necessarily the solution, and also where the solutions themselves are not obvious and are also far from commerciality. So in these kind of sectors, there is a need to sort of bring together the different players in the sectors, the different operators in that sector, to think about what are the kinds of investments that need to be made by all the different players in the sector in order to accelerate action towards decarbonizing. Here, I always give the example of aviation, of which we are part of a coalition for action. You need action simultaneously to create a low carbon supply. So you need suppliers like Shell ramping up and providing low carbon fuel. But you also need, at the same time, airlines sort of preparing to take on board and to adopt those low carbon fuels. And you need airports also investing in refueling facilities that accommodate and take that fuel. So again, it's not a sequential investment by the different players in each sector, but instead a common understanding and simultaneous investment by the different players in the sector in order to then speed up the process of decarbonizing within these sectors. Now, the last but not the least is around coherent policy frameworks. Now, all of the above, the mitigating economic and social impacts, sectoral coalitions for action, all of those eventually will require policy frameworks that support and manage the transition and support the action at the sectoral level in order to ramp it up to the scale needed for the US energy system to decarbonize. There is a bit around that, around having comprehensive and economy-wide sort of targets, for example, for decarbonizing are very helpful in giving clarity for long-term investments. It's around having carbon pricing that helps reallocate resources across the economy. But at the same time, you need to think about policies that are sector-specific, that address the needs, energy needs of a particular sector, and support both demand, supply, and infrastructure towards low carbon in those sectors being developed so that pace can be accelerated. And then finally, there's a need to have credible and predictable pathway for energy transition. And this is so that society is able to see the benefits that it will accrue from the transition, so that every part of society feels vested in it and is contributing to that transition, which becomes absolutely essential in order to make it happen at the speed that's needed. Now, if you go to the last slide, which is my last one, it's a lot of material that we've done, and you can obviously read a lot of that in the sketch itself. But these are sort of the 5 actions that we took away in terms of what needs to start happening today for this sketch to get on that track. And it's elements of what you've heard me go through. It's about investing in low carbon fuels and technologies to drive down costs, drive up adoption. It's building low carbon infrastructure to enable that adoption at scale. Business coalitions for hard to abate sectors to accelerate action in those sectors. I think there's accelerating action through greater policy alignment. Again, we've seen a lot of activity at state level, at city level, through private sector initiatives. But really reaching this level of deep decarbonizing requires a greater coherence across these different actors, so everyone's pulling in the same direction. And finally, enabling a fair and inclusive transition. And again, this is around making sure that society goes alongside with this transition and is able to support the speed at which this transition needs to happen in order for the US system to decarbonize. So that's me. It's quite a quick canter through quite a lot of rich material, but I'll stop there and hand over back to Bob.
Okay. Thank you, Mallika, for that, and Jeremy. There's a lot of questions coming in, but let me, and then David, thank you for joining in this end conversation here. And I'm trying to bundle some of the questions here, but let me ask you first. I mean, I think, some of the questions are about carbon pricing and, even down to what is Shell thinking about in terms of the politics of getting carbon pricing in the United States and how that might come about. It is a policy that a lot of scenario analysis, including this one here, assume that kind of economic drivers in the system. What do you think? What are you guys thinking on the outlook of that, and particularly in the rest of your industry? And I'll leave it to you guys to figure out how you want to answer that. But I think it'd be a good part of the conversation. What are you thinking about this policy, even though it obviously is in your analysis?
Yeah, we won't take too much time, but maybe I'll just kick off and then hand on to Mallika and David, who put a lot of thought into this. I mean, clearly, we believe that markets are a very effective and efficient way to achieve ends. And clearly, if your ends are decarbonization, then economy-wide carbon pricing is playing a role within that. And we know that there are different approaches to that, either hidden approaches through mandates, which are shadow carbon prices, through to explicit markets, through to taxation, and those are political questions to handle. But if you're trying to achieve an end through markets, which are the most powerful engine for these things, then carbon pricing is playing a role efficiently in that. Folks, do you please add to that?
Yes, so if I can, Jeremy, you're absolutely right. So the carbon pricing that we're looking at here includes, it's not picking a trading price or a tax or a performance standards or mandates. Initially, it covers the whole range of approaches you have to price it in. But what I would say is that we thought quite hard about how carbon pricing would play through in the US and the US economy. And it's very much, it starts out with sort of disaggregated, so at state level pricing happening through some cases tax, to some cases trading, to some cases performance standards and mandates, and then building up ahead of steam as it goes towards 2050. We were very conscious of the fact that this is a tough space to navigate, and also the US has a huge sort of base of innovation and creativity that it demonstrates. So this scenario sketch, as Jeremy said in the beginning, is based off of on that innovation and that drive on low carbon tech and fuels and driving those costs down. And then, so the carbon price is in very much of a support role to that in the initial years. And then as, these become available, these options, then it becomes sort of meaningful in terms of driving those choices. So again, it is, it's quite, we thought quite hard about how it would play and what its role would be over the course of the next 30 years. But really, as Jeremy said, if you're going to reach this level of decarbonization, you have to have some form of carbon pricing that builds up into something meaningful towards the end of the scenario.
And if I can just add one more thing, because I've seen in the Q&A, that's a lot of questions, but there's a little link there. As an organization, we've advocated for carbon pricing in the economy for several years in the US and around the world, and we'll continue to push for that because we think that's important. And indeed, we will always continue to push for the things that we think are right. So there have been a couple of questions about how do we justify what we've been doing when we've known about things like climate change for a long time. And I can go back to my predecessors who back in the late 80s were producing films and publications around emissions and the importance of that. And as a company, we founded areas like, I was the chief executive officer of Shell Hydrogen back at the turn of the century. But society and customers weren't responding to that. So we continue to be very transparent about our positions on that, but we look to working closely with customers and other parts of society in actually taking up these opportunities, and including the opportunities that we've identified in this sketch we've been sharing.
Yeah,
just to add to that, I think it's worth saying that there's already multiple carbon prices operating in the US today.
correct.
And as Mallika said, this scenario imagines this starts off in quite a fragmented way. And that's exactly what exists today in the US. So you've got a carbon pricing system running in the Northeast states that's relatively modest. You've got two carbon prices operating in California, one around $20 per ton and a second one around $200 per ton. And you also have economy-wide, not so much prices, but economy-wide carbon pricing opportunities. For instance, the 45Q CCS technology initiative. So this is the sort of fragmented landscape. Now, I think they are going to have to coalesce in some sort of way, but the US is not devoid of carbon pricing, at the start.
Right. It's certainly pricing out there, but this really is predicated on an economy-wide, gradually increasing over time carbon price, obviously, which is an economically efficient way. Let's this is a tough policy for the United States to swallow. And so you have to wonder, how will we achieve these goals if we still have this fragmented approach over the next, who knows how many, I'll go ahead and say it, presidential elections. But putting it aside, let me get to some of the other questions, because I think they're also important. And I think if I can bundle a little bit here, there are many questions about some of the trade-offs here that become apparent. If you increase BECCS or bioenergy with carbon capture for negative emissions, or you're using or the land use for some of the renewables, how much have some of these trade-offs been taken into account as you guys are looking at it? If you build the kind of renewable energy we're talking about here, it obviously will use up.
Yep. Let me again kick off, and I'm sure my colleagues can add more detail. But as we've looked at renewable resources around the world, we've worked with the most credible not-for-profits that study these things. One that comes to mind is Ecofis, to look in detail at what is available over everywhere in the world at a very granular level. So kind of all our work is taking into account the true availability of resource, including then the trade-offs that are made, because indeed land use, there are calls on land use obviously for agriculture, but also for urban development, also for afforestation. And so these are, there are some political choices in there, but we've not counted. Yeah.
And food production.
Indeed, absolutely. And so biofuels and food production, that's why the focus moves towards the advanced biofuels, which can be grown on land that isn't suitable for use for food generation and what have you. So we've been very careful not to double count or to do impossible trade-offs.
Just to add to that, I mean, biomass was something that was surprised us at the scale of, that it came up at. And again, it's sort of, we did a lot of research around supply of sustainable biomass. So this is based on Department of Energy's estimates of the kinds of sustainable levels of biomass that could be coming into play by 2050. So again, that it looks at both sustainability defined as food impact on the food chain, as well as on habitats and biodiversity. So we have looked at that. And again, paired with the fact that the US has so much geological storage, I mean, that's why it sort of came up as a solution in this modeling that we did, as a sort of a combination that could be deployed. And then again, it's a cost-effective combination, it turns out, in our modeling and in our assumptions. And so it plays a big role in this. Now, I have to say that when we do this, this is our assessment of that pathway, of what the best trade-offs are. And I think a lot of this comes down to what policy effort and preferences might be in different states or at an overall level. And so if there is a sort of a more preference to have less bio and do some, then you have to do something more somewhere else. So you have to either accelerate some of the other clean techs, or you need to drive more efficiency and behavior change, or you need to do some more removal somewhere. So again, I think it's okay that this is our pathway that we think is the most cost effective, but with different priorities, you could have a different combination of these things coming together.
Yeah, these trade-offs are inherent in the entire analysis, and I think you've answered that you've tried to take these into account to some extent, and obviously predicting the future is always, you guys are, working on it, and you identify the fact that there's a lot of potential geologic sequestration. So but you also showed a fairly significant through time decline in the use of fossil fuels. What does this scenario mean for Shell?
Well, clearly, a lot of people think of us from a historical perspective as an oil and gas company, and that's been an important part of our history. But we're actually, really an energy major now. I think we're the second or third largest electricity trader in the United States, for example. Really, the focus is on serving customers with their energy needs. And so that kind of customer-focused perspective, and then the marketing and trading activities that enable that, and then looking also for strongholds in the supply chains. So we have a world-leading liquefied natural gas business. That's an important stronghold in a particular supply chain, but a supply chain to serve particular customers. Similarly, we have strongholds in deep water production, and these will evolve over time. But the prime focus is on customers and enabling them to have their energy needs and enabling them on their decarbonization journey. Because indeed, of course, the bulk of emissions are produced in the use of energy rather than in the production of it.
Yeah. You also showed a fairly significant, well, you showed a decline in fossil, like in the energy production and in transportation. You showed an increase in hydrogen. I think, Mallika, you had a slide that went from gray hydrogen to blue-green hydrogen. You might want to talk about how you see that, how you see that working. I mean, a lot of people have looked at hydrogen and are looking at hydrogen. There were a number of questions about why not use hydrogen for power generation instead of methane. You guys leave a little bit of methane in your electricity analysis, and assuming you'll take care of that with carbon capture. But what about this other? How did that play out in your thinking?
I'll kick off, but simply because I used to be the chief executive of Shell Hydrogen back in the day. It's a long time ago now, because we've been in this game for a long time. If you think about it, just on that power question, effectively, natural gas with CCS is running a hydrogen power plant, more or less there. And whilst you see in this kind of end-use energy kind of chart that Mallika showed, what seems to be a big build-up from hardly anything in the use of hydrogen, that's in this particular energy end use. The figures may have changed a little bit from my days, but industrially, I mean, hydrogen is an industrial chemical. It's used in refining, it's used in fertilizer generation, etc. And there's about 60 million megatons a year of hydrogen produced. And if that was all to be put, for instance, into vehicle transportation, it would fuel every vehicle in the United States. So the question really is, taking hydrogen from its industrial use into a broader use in transport and in industry.
Without the carbon dioxide emissions that are generated from the production of hydrogen.
Yes, so the clearly, if you're looking, and that was that question really of grey hydrogen, referring to the way hydrogen is largely produced now through steam methane reforming, into steam methane reforming with CCS, into the use of electricity through electrolysis generation, and that electricity coming from zero carbon sources as well. So you can see that and see that mix, and you will see increasingly. We're just opening up, I think, Europe's largest electrolyzer shortly for the production of hydrogen from electricity. So you will see that. But as you're trying to do everything and trying to do it on a very advanced time scale, then you will see that blue hydrogen, so hydrogen with CCS attached, will play a role alongside green hydrogen as that grows. But in the long term, it will shift to the all green hydrogen.
And the one thing here I would want to make, I mean, we thought about it because you just wait for green hydrogen to come. And I think here what the thinking was that a lot of this requires infrastructure. You need to scale up quite quickly. And so again, you can get the ball rolling with getting the gray hydrogen, building out the transport, storage, refueling infrastructure alongside. And then, the mix then just shifts towards green over time. And so I think that's a little bit of the ramp, the profile over the next 30 years.
Okay, so I think we talked about the hydrogen a little bit, and obviously there's a bunch of challenges there as well and trade-offs that we were already talking about. When I go back to the electricity scenario you had a complete elimination of coal and then a decline in natural gas, but in 2050 there was still some, and again we just talked about could it be hydrogen or something else or carbon capture, but you also had a static line for nuclear and a very large growth, I think, which all of us are anticipating and expect in renewables and wind and solar. So tell us a little bit about that, the mix there with the nuclear. What was happening in the modeling that you did there with nuclear? Was it the price? Was it policy? What was driving that to be static?
I'll kick off with a couple of things, and then I'll ask the folks who've done more of the actual modeling itself. But if I look globally at nuclear, then there's a couple of things that are going on. So clearly with nuclear, you've got a zero carbon electricity source, and that has a role to play. But because of all the other reasons, there's been very little build of nuclear for a long time in many parts of the world, and so many plants are coming to the end of their lifetime, and so even for things to continue at one level, you're actually seeing a big turnover in terms of refurbishing or retiring plants and rebuilding plants as well. And whole new industries have to be rebuilt to do that. Whole new generations of nuclear engineers need to be trained to do that. And at the same time, you're competing with other sources of electricity. The controllability of nuclear helps you in managing the intermittency from your winds and your solars, etc. Even to keep a static amount of nuclear in the system actually means you're putting a lot of attention into it. Mallika, do you have anything to add from the modeling that you and Glenn did?
No, just, I mean, that you answered that question. I'll just say that we looked also at the retirement of the existing nuclear fleet in this context. So even though the amount of electricity generated from nuclear sort of remains constant over this scenario, significant investment in sort of new nuclear, if you like, is implied in this as the fleet declines. So again, that captures a little bit of innovation around what that new nuclear might look like. And again, as Jeremy said, a lot of we don't think you need that much balancing, but there is a role for nuclear alongside gas with CCS and biomass with CCS to balance the high renewable system.
Okay, well, I think we're like right at the end of our time here, and if I ask another question, I think it'll go over. But do you guys want to say? And I want to end by making sure everybody on the listening in and who was listening in and had to drop off, these slides will be made available to you directly. It also, I think, is on Shell's website, and it'll also probably be available, as will the recording of this webinar will be on our website as well. So, and we'll, our follow-up email will have the slide deck attached to it, so everybody will have it as an end thing. And I guess I want to thank you guys for doing this. I know that I'm looking at the questions here. Some of them are really good technical questions, balancing different modeling that other people have done. And I mean, we could go on all day here, and I unfortunately we have a lot at the time we have. So I'm going to thank you and thank everybody for tuning in and for the questions. I think you probably will be able to have some of the contact information of the presenters here, and you can feel free, separate from this, to follow up with the Shell team. And we appreciate you guys presenting your findings on what things look like in the United States from your perspective. A lot of work, a lot of trying to coalition building, as you pointed out, to see if we can actually get there, and that's what we're all working on. So thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, and it's great to have this opportunity to share this. Please, folks who are listening, download the detailed report, because you might find many of your questions answered there. Indeed, there is the opportunity for us to grasp this opportunity, and particularly for the United States to move from being perceived as a laggard into being perceived as a leader in this area as well.